Some legends don't wear medals, they carry notebooks. Harrison Ford hadn't touched a cockpit in years, but one blazing afternoon in Arizona, he stood quietly at the edge of an airfield, watching the A-10 Warthog rise into the sky. He didn't come for recognition. He came for something deeper: legacy. And what happened next, no one could have scripted. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from. And if this story moves you, don't forget to subscribe. They barely noticed him at first, just a slow-moving figure making his way along the outer fence line of the airfield. The summer sun reflected off his scuffed aviator sunglasses, and the creases on his face told of decades spent outdoors, not in front of screens. He wore a faded flight jacket, its original olive green bleached into a sandy hue by time and sun. The patches on the sleeves had lost their edges, their meaning long forgotten by most who looked. A weathered cap with the insignia of the Air National Guard rested low on his brow. In one hand, he gripped a wooden cane more out of habit than need. In the other, a small, leather-bound notebook, edges worn and corners curled. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if each step was measured not just by muscle but by memory. A group of teenagers leaning against the barrier noticed him as he neared. One elbowed another, smirking. Bet he drove fuel trucks back in the day. He muttered loud enough for the old man to hear. Another chimed in, or maybe just handed out water bottles. Those patches looked like they came from a Halloween costume. The third just laughed. The old man said nothing. He didn't even glance in their direction. He simply stopped a few feet away, adjusted the strap on his shoulder, and looked out across the tarmac. The sound of jet engines spooling up in the distance rolled across the airfield like thunder through dry grass. His eyes didn't blink. They tracked movement only he seemed to notice. His left thumb unconsciously rubbed the spine of the notebook he held, the way someone might rub a worry stone. Not for luck, for grounding. One of the teenagers tilted his head. He's really into this. Huh. Probably thinks he could fly one of those if you gave him a few minutes. They chuckled again, but their voices faded into background noise as the announcer's voice crackled over the loudspeakers, welcoming the crowd to the Thunder Over America air show. Ladies and gentlemen, in just a few minutes, you'll witness the awesome power and precision of the A-10 Thunderbolt II, affectionately known as the Warthog. The only aircraft designed entirely around its cannon, the A-10 has served American forces for nearly 5 decades. The old man's jaw shifted slightly, not quite a smile, not quite a grimace, just a flicker of memory passing through muscle. Behind him, a father gently tugged his young daughter away. She had been staring at the old man's notebook, curious. "Don't bother the old-timer, sweetheart," he said in a hushed tone that wasn't quite quiet enough. The girl looked back once, then followed. Still, the man said nothing. He rested both hands on top of his cane and leaned forward slightly, gaze fixed on the far end of the runway. In that moment, he wasn't just watching. He was remembering, calculating, anticipating. Inside that worn notebook were hand-drawn schematics, margin notes, combat data, adjustments to loadout configurations, angles of approach, emergency egress timings. None of it typed, all of it drawn by hand, from memory. It had traveled with him through deserts and hangars, field tests and meetings that never made the minutes. But none of that mattered here. To most people around him, he was just an old man in a jacket that didn't fit quite right anymore, standing too close to the barrier, squinting like he didn't quite understand what he was seeing. But they were wrong, because he understood exactly what was coming. The old man shifted his weight slightly and opened the leather-bound notebook with care, as if it were made of something more delicate than paper and ink. The pages inside were filled with line drawings, numbers, angles, and notations written in a precise, compact script, not the doodles of an enthusiast. These were the marks of someone who had lived each calculation, who had tested these maneuvers not on a simulator screen, but in the unforgiving sky. A child might have seen a sketch of a plane diving with curved arrows trailing behind it. But a pilot would have recognized a precision attack pattern, wind drift corrections, and adjusted entry vectors for adverse weather. A gust of wind flipped one page, revealing a grid of coordinates and something that looked like a hand-drawn terrain map. Faded pencil lines curved along what had once been enemy ridge lines in the Kuwaiti desert. Next to each ridge, notations in all caps. Crosswind 17 knots. Pull up 40 FT VS. Limit 1.2 MI. These weren't relics. They were memories made visible. One page further, and there it was, the sketch of a Bell UH-1 helicopter, a Huey with marks showing its center of gravity shifted for emergency cargo weight. There were notes written next to it. Shorthand only someone who had lived it could understand: low ceiling, no flare, max pitch 13 degree. Harrison's finger stopped on that note. His jaw tightened ever so slightly. It had been 30 years, maybe more. A training flight gone sideways near Fallon, Nevada. Two young pilots caught in a sudden squall. No visibility, communications out. The towers scrambled aircraft, but no one could reach them in time, except him. He had been on the ground, pre-flighting a bird for a maintenance hop, a Huey, half full of tools, barely fueled, but he took off anyway. No authorization, no delay, just instinct and decades of knowing how weather moves across a valley. He had found them by tracking the break in cloud movement, something only a trained eye would notice, and landed on the edge of a ravine, just long enough to pull them in before the wind flipped the bird sideways. The landing had torn a ligament in his shoulder. The rescue earned him nothing more than a quiet handshake from the base commander and a note in a file marked civilian asset. Behind him, a soft voice broke the silence. "Excuse me, sir," said the little girl again. She had slipped away from her father and was peering at the open notebook in his hand. "Are those pictures of real planes?" Harrison looked down, not startled, just surprised someone had noticed. He gave her a small nod, just enough to acknowledge her question. "Yes," he said. His voice was low, dry like gravel under wheels. "Very real." Before she could ask more, her father appeared and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Come on, honey. Let's not bother the old-timer." He offered a tight smile to Harrison, not unkind but dismissive in the way people often are when they assume age means irrelevance. Harrison closed the notebook without a word. The leather creaked softly as the flap folded back into place. To everyone else, the air show was just beginning. The announcer's voice boomed over the speakers again, introducing the aircraft lineup and teasing the crowd about the coming A-10 demonstration. But to Harrison, the show had started the moment he opened that notebook. Every sound of the engines revving, every vibration in the air, was a whisper from the past. He had never worn stars on his collar, never chased rank, never asked for medals, but in quiet rooms, behind closed hangar doors, his voice had shaped how the Warthog would fly, how it would fight, how it would bring people home. None of that was on display today. It never would be. But the sky remembered, and that was enough. The distant roar grew louder as the announcer's voice swelled with excitement. "Ladies and gentlemen, prepare yourselves for the tank killer, the guardian angel of ground troops. The A-10 Thunderbolt II is moments away." The crowd leaned forward, necks craning toward the horizon. Phones raised, eyes widened. But one man didn't move. Harrison Ford stood motionless, the corners of his mouth lifting just slightly. Not amusement, not pride, recognition. The silhouette that broke the heat shimmer over the runway was unmistakable. Twin engines mounted high, broad, straight wings, a snub nose that had never been designed for beauty. But to those who knew, it was the most comforting shape in the sky. The A-10, he murmured under his breath, voice barely audible over the growing hum. Two General Electric TF-34s, 9,065 pounds of thrust each, titanium bathtub, redundant hydraulics, avionics revised in '93, recoil damping, adjusted in '89. It wasn't boasting, it was memory, muscle deep. The announcer caught up a few seconds later. listing nearly the same specifications as the crowd cheered. Harrison didn't cheer. He simply watched. As the Warthog approached for its first pass, the sunlight caught its belly. The weapon that defined its existence was right there. Bold and blunt, the GRU-8 Avenger, a 7-barrel Gatling-style cannon that fired depleted uranium rounds at a rate that could shred armored columns. Harrison's hand tightened around the notebook. He had traced that cannon's recoil arc so many times he could still draw it with his eyes closed. The aircraft had been designed around the gun, not the other way around. That choice had made the program a nightmare to budget, but a miracle on the battlefield. He remembered the meeting, a windowless room, a group of brass on one side, his civilian engineering team on the other. He had stepped forward, pointing to a chart showing low-altitude survivability and sustained fire support. "Ground troops don't need speed," he had said calmly. "They need something that stays with them. That takes hits. That bites back." The general across the table had barely looked up. "You're a civilian, Mr. Ford. You don't wear a uniform. You don't get to redefine doctrine." And he hadn't, not officially. But over time, the tactics changed. The altitudes dropped. The loiter time increased. The armor plating thickened. The proof had been in the field report's survivability rates climbing. Missions completed under conditions no other aircraft dared enter. And buried deep in the appendix of one of those reports was a diagram. A hand-drawn sketch with annotations in the margins, uncredited. Now the crowd roared as the A-10 pulled into a slow banking turn, revealing its undercarriage to the audience below. Harrison whispered the maneuver. 5-degree nose drop. Power held steady at 70%. Air brake engaged at apex. It turned exactly as it had been designed to. Exactly as he had envisioned during those long nights bent over drafts on a metal table, lit by a single swinging lamp. None of that was in the program today. The announcer talked about the battles won, the lives saved, the durability, the firepower. But no one mentioned the rewrites, the hand-scrawled adjustments, the times he and a handful of engineers slept in hangars because redesigning a mount bracket needed testing by sunrise. It had never been about credit. Harrison had never asked for that, but he had fought for the aircraft like it was his own blood, because in a way, it was. And now, standing there with the sun on his face and the thunder of turbines in his ears, it was still flying, against all odds, against all attempts to retire it, still protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, the aircraft that wouldn't die, and the man who refused to let it. The A-10 came in low on its next pass. Wings steady, nose down, engines growling like a distant storm moving over desert rock. Harrison didn't flinch. His eyes tracked every subtle shift in angle, every minor trim adjustment in the ailerons. The aircraft was flying clean, confident, and more than anything, familiar. He knew that rhythm, the smooth transitions, the perfect line maintenance through crosswind. He had taught that years ago, long before the world forgot who wrote the notes in the margins. The announcer called out, "At the controls today, ladies and gentlemen, is Captain A-10 Ford, one of the youngest pilots ever assigned to the 74th Fighter Squadron. Watch his precision on this next maneuver." Harrison exhaled slowly. He didn't smile, but something in his face softened. The boy had good hands, steady, disciplined. He hadn't told anyone he was coming today. He had planned to watch from the crowd, just another face among thousands. No ceremony, no introductions. Just the sky and the machine and the memory of what it took to get here. A man to his left kept glancing over. Mid-50s, retired military by the look of the stance and the creases on his sleeves. The man squinted, tilting his head as if trying to line up a memory that refused to settle. "I'm sorry," the man said cautiously, "but you look familiar. Were you at Nellis back in the 80s? Or maybe Edwards Harrison didn't answer?" He just gave a polite nod and looked back toward the airfield. The man hesitated, clearly unsettled, then quietly stepped back, though his eyes lingered, still trying to place the face, still wondering why it seemed so significant. A few feet away, a young photographer was weaving through the crowd, Camera slung tight, shooting reaction shots. Children with hands pressed to their ears. Couples with mouths open in awe. Veterans with folded arms in silent pride. His lens swung instinctively toward Harrison, drawn by something he couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the posture, or the stillness, or the way the old man stood as if he were measuring more than performance, as if he were verifying. The photographer zoomed in. His eye caught the edge of a patch sewn into the inner sleeve of Harrison's jacket, just visible beneath a fold. He focused tighter. The patch was old, frayed, but the emblem was still clear. A winged silhouette with 3 stars beneath and a banner that read, barely legible CivTac Aerial Project. He blinked. That name wasn't on any of the public squadron lists. In fact, it wasn't listed anywhere, except maybe in internal Air Force archives labeled restricted. He lowered the camera slowly, uncertainty blooming into realization. Whoever this man was, he wasn't just another veteran reliving glory days. In the sky above, the A-10 leveled out, heading into a slow turn. Captain Ethan Ford's voice came faintly over the comms piped into the sound system. Confident, controlled, explaining the maneuver he was about to perform. Harrison didn't look away. His hands remained still on the head of his cane, but his eyes told a different story. They were following not just the aircraft but the pilot. Every motion, every degree of roll, every second of delay. He knew that flying style. That was his blood up there. And then, for the briefest moment, the A-10 banked to the left and passed directly in front of the crowd. The canopy flashed silver in the sunlight, and from inside, Captain Ethan Ford scanned the faces below. Thousands of upturned heads. But something made him pause. His gaze snagged on a figure by the front rail. Not because he recognized the face, but because something felt off, like a memory trying to claw its way out of a locked drawer. Harrison didn't wave, didn't move. He just stared back, calm and unblinking. For a second, their eyes met. The jet moved on, but the question had been planted, unspoken, undefined, yet impossible to shake. The sky kept moving, but something below had shifted. The next maneuver was supposed to be a textbook pass, a simulated strafing run across the demonstration field, showing the Warthog's ability to drop low and fast before peeling off in a clean exit. The announcer's voice rose with anticipation, feeding the crowd's excitement. Watch now as Captain Ethan Ford demonstrates the A-10's precision approach. This is the aircraft that brings fear to enemy armor and hope to ground troops under fire. But something changed. It started as a subtle deviation. The A-10 didn't begin its descent as expected. Instead, it leveled out and began to bank slowly, deliberately away from the routine. The announcer's tone shifted. Ladies and gentlemen, please bear with us. That was not part of the planned flight path. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Phones lifted higher. A few heads turned toward the tower. Over the loudspeakers, clipped radio chatter spilled into the air. Captain Ford, this is Tower. Confirm return to designated pattern. Over. No response. The Warthog continued its turn, now facing the crowd directly. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't dramatic. Just purposeful. Controlled. As if the aircraft were searching for something or someone. In the crowd, the noise began to die down. People lowered their phones. Something about the way the plane moved didn't feel rehearsed. It felt personal. On the ground, Harrison Ford remained still, his cane pressed firm into the asphalt. His other hand clenched the worn notebook so tightly his knuckles had gone pale. His eyes locked onto the canopy of the descending aircraft. He wasn't guessing. He knew. From the sky, the A-10 approached low, its engines humming in a tone that seemed to vibrate the very air. Then it happened. A sudden dip of the left wing, then the right, then level again. 3 distinct motions. Not a stunt, not a flourish, but a message. One understood only by those who had worn the uniform, or stood close enough to feel its weight. The missing man formation. A tribute not of protocol, but of heart. A gesture reserved for those no longer with us, or for those whose legacy had gone unseen for too long. The announcer's voice caught, faltered. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not a scheduled maneuver. I believe we may be witnessing a tribute. The words trailed off as silence swept the field like a wave. Tens of thousands of people stood still. The roar of the engines was the only sound left. Mothers covered their children's ears, not from noise but from the raw emotion that now blanketed the moment. Veterans removed their hats. Others simply bowed their heads. Up in the cockpit, A-10 Ford said nothing, but he knew what he had seen. That face, that posture, that notebook. He hadn't been sure until now, but no one else stood like that. No one else looked at a warthog like it was part of them. He had spotted his grandfather in the crowd, not because someone told him, but because a lifetime of stories had shaped his instincts to recognize the man who had taught him to fly without ever stepping into his cockpit. Below, Harrison straightened, his spine no longer curved with age, his shoulders squared, eyes unwavering. The notebook trembled slightly in his grip, not from weakness, but from everything it meant in this moment. The boy in the sky had just broken protocol, risked reprimand, ignored the tower. For him, the crowd didn't know why the plane saluted. The officials didn't know why Captain Ford had veered, but Harrison knew. And for the first time in decades, something deep within him shifted. Not pride, not relief. Something older, like being seen after a lifetime of invisibility. The A-10 leveled out once more and pulled back into a slow arc above the field. The formation was done. The message had been delivered. The sky was quiet again. But something had changed. People began to murmur, to ask questions, to look back toward the man in the jacket with the old patches and the silent eyes. A few began to wonder out loud. Who was he? What did that signal mean? And why? When the A-10 saluted, did only one man seem to already understand what it was saying? The airfield had never been quieter. 50,000 people stood suspended in silence, as if the wind itself had paused out of respect. The A-10 had resumed its flight path, rejoining the demonstration loop, but no one was watching the maneuvers anymore. All eyes had shifted to the man at the barrier, the old man in the flight jacket, the one who hadn't flinched, who hadn't cheered, who had simply stood still and understood. The announcer's voice came back, softer this time, uncharacteristically hesitant. Ladies and gentlemen, we've just received word from Airshow Command. The tribute performed moments ago was not spontaneous, it was intentional, and it was personal. A beat of silence. Among us today is Mr. Harrison Ford. Another pause. This one heavier. Not the actor, the announcer added quickly, with an awkward chuckle that evaporated as fast as it arrived, but someone who has perhaps contributed even more directly to the legacy of the aircraft you're seeing now. Murmurs broke out through the crowd. Heads turned. Whispers traveled faster than the PA system could keep up. Harrison Ford served as a civilian tactical advisor to the United States Air Force throughout the 1980s and early 90s. The announcer continued, he was part of a classified program known unofficially as the CivTac Aerial Project. His work in low-altitude maneuvering, recoil compensation modeling, and mission endurance planning played a key role in making the A-10 the battlefield legend it is today. A collective breath was held. On the big screens surrounding the airfield, static flickered for a second, then gave way to grainy footage from decades past. A younger man stood beside an early prototype of the A-10. No fanfare, just him in a dark olive jumpsuit, holding a rolled blueprint and gesturing toward the engine nacelle. He wore no rank, just a name patch, Ford. The image changed. Another clip, this time showing the same man crouched beside a chalkboard in a hangar, surrounded by flight crew. Arrows pointed to trajectory maps, hand-drawn in chalk. Overhead, a clock marked Duru 2:30 hours. In the crowd, one of the teenagers who had mocked the old man earlier blinked, then nudged his friend. Dude, he whispered, pulling out his phone, fingers already typing. Google him, right now. His friend stared at the screen, then looked up. Holy, that's really him. Meanwhile, the announcer's voice returned, quieter now. The pilot who performed that tribute, Captain Ethan Ford, is Mr. Ford's grandson? Up in the sky. Ethan's voice crackled through the comms, patched briefly into the public channel. That's correct, he said, calm and composed. That man down there is my grandfather. He's the reason I fly the Warthog, and the reason so many of us are still here to fly anything at all. People began to applaud. Not a roaring ovation, but a slow, building wave. It started near the front, from the veterans who had known without being told. Then it spread to the families, the bystanders, the skeptics, now shifting uncomfortably. Even the teenagers clapped, though their faces had changed. The laughter was gone. In its place, awe. Harrison didn't move. He didn't bow, didn't wave. He simply stood, eyes still on the aircraft, as if none of this were necessary, as if the only thing that had ever mattered was the plane still flying, and the boy inside it who had learned what mattered most. The footage faded, the screen went black, and for one long, reverent second, the field stood still once more. Because sometimes a lifetime of silence can be broken with one simple signal from the sky, and everyone who witnessed it would never forget what it meant. The A-10 came in slow on final approach. Landing gear extended, nose high. The crowd remained quiet, as if afraid that any noise might disturb the weight of the moment still hanging in the air. The jet touched down with a soft thump, rolling down the runway in perfect alignment before taxiing toward the crowd line. The announcer had fallen silent. There was nothing more to say. The rest belonged to the man who had once helped sketch the angles that allowed a machine like this to survive war. Ethan Ford stepped out of the cockpit, helmet tucked under his arm, eyes scanning the sea of faces as he descended the ladder. Ground crew gave him space. Officers watched in respectful silence. He moved with purpose, weaving through the crowd that parted instinctively until he stood face to face with the man he had just saluted from the sky. For a moment, neither said a word. Then Ethan came to attention and offered a crisp salute, sharp and steady. Harrison returned it, slower but no less precise. There was discipline in both men, but where Ethan's was born from training, Harrison's was carved from memory and muscle and time. You didn't tell me you were coming, Ethan said softly, still holding the salute a heartbeat longer than necessary. I didn't plan to, Harrison replied, his voice steady. Didn't think it was my place. Ethan lowered his hand. You're the reason I fly that jet. You should have been in the front row. I was, Harrison said, just not the kind that gets announced. Ethan hesitated, then asked, why didn't you say something to me? To anyone, Harrison looked past him for a moment, toward the A-10 now sitting quietly on the tarmac, its engines winding down like the slow exhale of a giant. I didn't come to be seen, he said. I came to see you fly. That was enough. The crowd gave them space, watching from a respectful distance, the moment too intimate to interrupt. Harrison reached into his jacket, slowly, deliberately. He pulled out the leather-bound notebook, edges weathered, spine soft with age. He held it for a second longer in his own hands, as if feeling the weight of every page one last time. Then, without a word, he extended it to Ethan. Ethan looked at it, confused at first, then realizing exactly what it was. He didn't reach for it right away. Is this? Harrison nodded. Every adjustment, every sketch, every maneuver we figured out after the manual said it couldn't be done, they're all in there, including the ones nobody ever approved but worked anyway. Ethan took the notebook with both hands carefully, like it might break. You never showed this to anyone. I didn't need to, Harrison said. The plane is still flying. That was all the proof I ever wanted. Ethan flipped through a few pages, eyes catching numbers and notations that he recognized. but not in the form he was used to. These weren't simulations. They were the bones of what had become doctrine, and they were written by someone who had never needed a rank to change the course of how battles were fought. Some of those pages, Harrison said quietly, saved lives. More than you'll probably ever know. Ethan looked up, voice caught in his throat. I don't know what to say. Harrison gave a faint smile. You don't need to say anything. Just keep flying, the way you did today. He placed a hand on his grandson's shoulder. The applause began again, soft at first, then swelling around them. But the two men didn't move. They just stood there, the silence between them filled with everything that didn't need to be spoken. The circle had closed, and somewhere deep above them, the sky remembered. The crowd had begun to disperse, but the air still held a quiet reverence, the kind that settles in after something sacred. Harrison stood with Ethan, the notebook now tucked securely under the young pilot's arm. When a group of men approached from beyond the security line, they moved with purpose. Not arrogance, not hesitation. Purpose. One of them, older than the rest, wore a ball cap marked with the insignia of the 3rd Armored Division. His gait had a limp that time couldn't quite erase. In his hand, he carried something wrapped in a small cloth. As they reached Harrison, the man stopped, took a breath, and said, Sir, I don't know if you remember Operation Hammer Ridge, Desert Storm, but we do. Harrison's eyes met his, steady and knowing. The man continued. We were pinned, couldn't move. Smoke so thick we couldn't see 10 feet ahead. We called for air support. They said visibility was too poor. But the Warthogs came anyway. They didn't fly above the clouds. They came in low, real low. Saved all 23 of us. He unfolded the cloth to reveal an old, sand-faded patch. We made these after a tribute to whoever had the guts to recommend those tactics. Took us years to find out it was you. He extended the patch. It's yours, my sir. Always should have been. Harrison accepted it wordlessly. He looked at the faded threads, ran a thumb over the edge. It wasn't polished. It wasn't formal, but it meant more than any metal could. A quiet thank you from the ones who knew what it cost. Nearby, a voice cut through the murmur. Young, hesitant. Sir, one of the teenagers from earlier stood with his hands at his sides, shame plain on his face. I was one of the guys who laughed before. I'm sorry. Truly. I didn't know. He paused and then added, I want to study aerospace engineering. I didn't think it mattered, but now I see it does. Harrison didn't scold him. He simply nodded once. Then make sure what you build brings people home. That's the only thing that ever matters. Ethan stepped in beside them, opening the notebook gently. The teen leaned closer. So did a few others. Ethan pointed to a drawing, explaining how this adjustment shortened the engagement window by 2 seconds, but increased survivability by 10%. They listened. Really listened. Harrison stepped back. Let them have the moment. He turned his eyes once more to the sky. The A-10 circled overhead one final time, banking gently against the amber light of the late afternoon sun. Its silhouette, worn and imperfect, cut across the sky like a memory that refused to fade. Harrison watched it disappear behind a cloud bank, and in that quiet, he let the thought rise without speaking it aloud. Sometimes you don't need your name remembered. Sometimes it's enough just to know you did the right thing. And the sky, it remembers. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.